Tusla's toxicity is hiding in plain sight in February's headlines. Join the dots and you will see that Tusla is probably the state's most dysfunctional agency.
We have hundreds of children now going missing from state care on an annual basis. The Irish Examiner reports today that just in January, 22 children went missing from state care just in that month. An incredible situation. The state is in loco parentis of these children and is now losing hundreds of these children on an annual basis. Children taken into Tusla potentially because of sexual abuse are then being lost to the state, leaving them potentially as targets for traffickers for sexual abuse. The state is meant to be a sanctuary for these children in the difficulties that they are in, but it is either through ineptitude or resource disinterest, leaving these same children to be lost to abuse again. Incredibly, I've asked Tusla how many children have reported sexual abuse while in state care, and Tusla have told me they simply don't record that information centrally. Data shown to 𝐴IN2 as well, shown that over 200 children have died either in state care or known to state care in the last 10 years. 38 of these children who've taken their own lives. Many more have died from overdoses and others who were murdered. And I want to state very clearly that the rank and file staff that are involved in the protection of children are doing their best. They're under enormous pressure. Many of them are suffering burnout. But if this happened to children in the past, there would be a state apology and there would be a full investigation. Taoiseach, or Taoiseach, why is your government not taking the horrendous neglect of children in state care seriously? 𝐴IN2 has been carrying out significant research on this issue of children in state care by way of parliamentary questions, mostly to Minister Roger O'Gorman's department, and the information is absolutely shocking. Now, Tusla has admitted to me, by way of parliamentary questions as well, that they are putting many of these vulnerable children into what's called unregulated residential units called special emergency arrangements. These are typically just rented apartments, and these SEAs often are staffed by unvetted staff. It is astounding that any government would put children who are so vulnerable into this particular situation.
Concerns are growing over how some children end up in what is termed special emergency arrangements. Well, our reporter Brian O'Connell has received new figures which show just how much the state is spending on these unregulated spaces, how many children are involved, and why there are growing calls for this type of provision to end.
Now, while Tusla say they carry out audits, these are essentially unregulated placements, mostly, as you said, in rented accommodation, apartments and houses. Staffing is provided by third parties. However, hotels and B&Bs may also be used only when some types of accommodation are not available. Young people would have a social worker, but essentially there is very little oversight of what's happening inside these settings, and that is where there is growing concern now. Last year, for example, the Child Law Project, they felt the need to highlight this as an area of concern in their reporting. The Child Law Project would attend childcare proceedings. They publish a report twice a year. What they say is that there's increasing concern, so much so that actually courts are having in some instances to get more and more involved in almost managing the placement once they've made an order. This is what Dr. Maria Corbett, who's Child Law Project CEO, had to say.
We've been reporting for 11 years, so a pattern of seeing young primary school age children entering residential care is something new that we're seeing. We're also seeing older children who are in residential care, but they're having a high number of placements in a short period of time. So the children are effectively bouncing around from placement to placement. But if you're seeing children in emergency placements and numerous emergency placements, there is a sense there that things are very unsettled for the child, very unstable. And some of these children, in the examples that we've had, they would be described as having high number of needs. In July 2023, we published a letter that was issued by the sitting district court judge, Judge Sims, who's since retired. He wrote to a number of ministers and a number of officials expressing his concern around the care system and also the use of unregistered placements. So they're often referred to as special emergency arrangements. So it's outside of the inspection regime. It's not being inspected against the national standard, so it's in a different category.
Figures I received from tusla show we're spending massive amounts of money on these arrangements. In 2023, tusla tell me they spent just over €71 million on special emergency arrangements. I put some of these issues to the Children's Ombudsman and spoke with 𝐬𝐿 Ward. She's Director of Investigations in the Ombudsman for Children's Office.
The reason that we are so concerned about the quality of services that children receive in Ireland is because we cannot forget the history, the dark history that Ireland has in terms of caring for children that we have removed from their families. So we are standing on the shoulders of those survivors. In relation to special care, I'm sure everyone may know, but special care is when a child is detained for welfare reasons. Now, as you can appreciate, that's an extraordinary step, and it can only be made by the order of the High Court, and yet there is no placement for them. And yet these are the very children who are then placed in hotels, B&Bs, with unknown agency staff and being looked after in the least secure, least supportive environment. So that's why we are concerned not only about the lack and insufficient places of special care, but the subsequent impact of these special emergency placements becoming in any way a normal part of our provision of care. On a legislative basis, we have called for these special emergency placements should not be allowed, that they should not be permitted. This is what has happened in the UK because of these children are getting sexually and criminally exploited because they are in insecure settings without adults caring for them properly. So we have said cease and desist. They should never be placed in any unregulated setting.
So that's 𝐬𝐿 Ward there in the Children's Ombudsman's office, ending Brian O'Connell's report. Kate Duggan, CEO of tusla there, is here with me. 𝐬𝐿 Ward there was using the example of what's happened in the UK, where they know there has been sexual exploitation of these children and they're at high risk. We know it's happening here too. I mean, 𝐓𝐿𝐿 told you, as was reported in the Irish Times this month, that children faced a significant risk of being harmed at a tusla-operated residential centre, incidences of bullying and assault in the facility. Why are you putting vulnerable children in this position?
And when we look to the past, as was referred to in the report, in the past, often those children were taken to a Garda station, they were taken to a hospital as part of a social admission where appropriate placement couldn't be found.
Is this any better? Like, are the staff there vetted? Do you know what's going on in these places?
Yeah, so just to say and to give some level of assurance, we've seen over the last 18 months this significant increase in demand and a significant increase in usage, in that we have seen, as I said now, up on kind of 61 mainstream but 115 special emergency arrangements. And in recognising that, we've put, I suppose, very robust systems in place in terms of the approval of these placements, which are, for the main part, apartments, leased buildings. We've put in place...
Who's staffing them? Do you know who's staffing them?
Absolutely.
Are they vetted?
Absolutely.
Because Peadar Tóibín says they're not vetted.
Yeah, no.
You're saying he is wrong. They are vetted.
Yeah, so I'm saying in terms of the systems of oversight that we've in place, if I maybe point out two of those systems. The first is where we now hold a central database of any staff member who is rostered to work in a special emergency arrangement. We've taken that on in tusla as a responsibility in terms of checking that vetting, validating vetting and qualifications, and our own internal
so you're doing
service
that
monitoring team.
Yourselves. That's not under the normal system where people would be Garda vetted, is it?
We hold the evidence of their vetting.
Okay,
so the individual agency,
they are employed by private
So
companies.
they're employed by a private company who's responsible for the verification of their qualifications and their Garda vetting.
There's a lot of
but they
trust
have to
going on
supply
there, though,
that.
you know, there's a lot of trust happening there. And
that would be the same, Claire, when we use a community and voluntary sector to provide a service on our behalf.
Now, a report in this morning's Irish Times says that 𝐓𝐮𝐬, the Child and Family Agency, placed vulnerable children into unregulated emergency accommodation run by a company which fabricated pre-employment screening of staff. It cites an internal 𝐓𝐮𝐬 investigation which also found Garda vetting files clearing staff to work for the company had been altered. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Jack Power, reporter with the Irish Times.
So this internal report that we have side of effectively found that the pre-employment checks or screening of staff who were working for the company over a 2-year period were not up to scratch. They were effectively being fabricated in some instances by this company. There was other cases where people were allowed to work with children in care without up-to-date Garda vetting, and other cases where the 𝐓𝐶𝐬 inspectors found that Garda vetting clearance files had been altered when they were presented to the 𝐓𝐶𝐬 inspectors that were looking into these very concerning issues in this company that at the time was one of the largest providers of these special emergency arrangements on behalf of 𝐓𝐶𝐬.
Last month alone, 22 children went missing from state care. We know previously of a 14-year-old girl who was abducted by a criminal gang within minutes of being placed with 𝐓𝐶𝐬, and she was found 1 year later locked in a brothel. I tried to raise these matters with you, but you don't listen. A retired judge, Judge Sims, tried to raise these matters with you, but you deleted his files, citing GDPR. A whistleblower tried to make a protected disclosure in relation to unvetted care workers. 𝐓𝐶𝐬 tried to refuse that, but only the Commissioner has ruled now that they have to accept it. Last week on RTE Radio, 𝐓𝐶𝐬 CEO stated that staff and SEAs were absolutely vetted. Now we know from an article in the Irish Times yesterday that one company was providing falsified vetting documents to 𝐓𝐶𝐬, and that an internal 𝐓𝐶𝐬 report in July found that staff did not have up-to-date Garda clearance. The name of that company was Ideal Care. I understand that there's a Garda investigation into that matter. My question to you, Minister, is have you ever met with the owner of that company?
Minister. I don't believe that I have, Deputy, but I can come back and clarify that point for you.
I have in my hand, Minister, a document which shows that the owner of this company, which was investigated for alleged falsifying of vetting documents and received millions from the state with regards to the unregulated care of vulnerable children, was on the same committee as yourself when you were a councillor in your constituency. Yourself and Paul Reid, who went on to become the CEO of the HSE, both sat on a committee quarter after quarter, the Joint Policing Committee, with this individual. And I would ask you the question, have you ever spoken to him about the provision of care?
Take a look at some of the headlines from today's papers. Gardaí investigate care provider over staff checks. 𝐓𝐶𝐬 breached duty, says Supreme Court. Garda probe into claims 𝐓𝐶𝐬 placed children in unregulated housing. 𝐓𝐶𝐬 at risk of being held in contempt of court due to staff shortages. And in spite of all of this, Roderick O'Gorman, speaking at 𝐓𝐶𝐬's 10th anniversary celebration in Dublin Castle on the 6th of February, said that he had no problems with 𝐓𝐶𝐬. His exact words were, 𝐓𝐶𝐬 has never caused me or this government a moment of concern. Truly, it has been a torrid month for 𝐓𝐶𝐬.